The bitter Montana winter howled through the wooden slats of Fort Haven's stagecoach station like a hungry wolf seeking warmth, its icy fingers clawing at every gap in the weathered planks. Sarah Winters clutched her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders and the slight swell of her belly beneath, watching as the man who had ordered her as his bride read her letter of confession with growing disgust. The journey west had cost her everything she owned, but her hidden secret was about to cost her the future she had desperately gambled on. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Pregnant? Lawrence Miller spat the word like poison, crumpling her letter in his fist. I ordered a proper wife, not damaged goods carrying another man's bastard. His face flushed crimson against his neatly trimmed beard as he backed away from her as though her condition might be contagious. The stagecoach that had delivered Sarah to this remote outpost was already disappearing into the swirling snow, taking with it any hope of escape from her increasingly desperate situation. The small gathering of townsfolk who had assembled to witness the arrival of Miller's mail-order bride shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes while others stared with open curiosity. Sarah felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her as heavily as the child growing within her womb. At 22, she had exhausted all options in Philadelphia after her parents' deaths left her penniless and alone. The advertisement, seeking a respectable woman of good character to become wife to a successful merchant in Montana Territory, had seemed like divine providence. "Mr. Miller, please," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "I had no choice. After my situation became known, I lost my position at the school. I was desperate, and now you expect me to raise another man's child? To bring shame upon my business and standing in this community." Miller cut her off with a dismissive wave. "The arrangement is void, Miss Winters. You misrepresented yourself, and I owe you nothing." From the edge of the small crowd, Captain James Blackwood observed the unfolding scene with quiet intensity. The left side of his face bore the angry red scars from a Sioux arrow that had nearly taken his life at the Battle of Little Ridge 3 years prior. His cavalry uniform hung on his tall frame with military precision, despite being worn at the edges, a man whose outer appearance reflected the battle scars that ran far deeper than flesh. "She can't stay here," the station master interjected nervously. "This isn't a hotel, and the next eastbound stage won't come through for 2 weeks with the passes nearly snowed in." "That's hardly my concern," Miller replied coldly, already turning to leave. Perhaps she should have considered her options before attempting to trick an honest man into raising another's child. Sarah felt her legs weaken beneath her as the full weight of her situation crashed down upon her shoulders. The meager coins in her purse wouldn't buy a meal, let alone shelter for the night in this frontier town, where temperatures dropped well below freezing after sunset. The child within her, the result of trust misplaced in a charming assistant professor who had promised marriage before disappearing without a trace, kicked against her belly as if sensing her rising panic. "Mr. Miller," the voice that cut through the murmurs was deep and commanding, accustomed to being obeyed. Captain Blackwood stepped forward, his cavalry boots leaving precise imprints in the dusting of snow on the station platform. "Is this how men of Fort Haven treat women in difficult circumstances?" Miller bristled visibly. "This is hardly your concern, Captain. Military matters are one thing, but my personal affairs become everyone's concern when conducted so publicly," Blackwood finished for him, his scarred face impassive. "This woman has traveled nearly 2,000 miles based on your invitation and promise of marriage. Based on false pretenses, perhaps. But she stands before us nonetheless, with night approaching and nowhere to turn." The captain's gaze swept the gathered crowd, many of whom had the grace to look ashamed at their silent complicity. "Is there no Christian charity to be found in Fort Haven?" Mrs. Gunderson, the minister's wife, stepped forward hesitantly. "We might find room at the church, though it's scarcely heated at night." "That won't be necessary," Captain Blackwood interrupted, his voice level as he turned to Sarah. "Miss Winters, I believe there has been a misunderstanding. You were indeed expected, but by me, not Mr. Miller." A confused murmur rippled through the onlookers. Sarah stared at the captain, bewilderment momentarily displacing her fear. "I don't understand," she managed to say. "A simple clerical error in the correspondence," Blackwood continued smoothly. "It seems my letters and Mr. Miller's became confused. At the posting office, I am the one who arranged for a bride from Philadelphia." Miller's face contorted with indignation. "That's preposterous. Everyone knows I placed those advertisements months ago. And everyone knows that I recently purchased the old Hammond property with the intention of settling there," Blackwood countered calmly. "A man needs a wife to make a house a home, wouldn't you agree? Particularly one with experience and education, as I believe Miss Winters has. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Sarah watched this exchange with mounting confusion. The scarred cavalry officer was clearly fabricating this entire scenario, but why would he insert himself into her humiliation? "Captain Blackwood," she began uncertainly, "I don't recall any correspondence." "You're exhausted from your journey, my dear," he interrupted gently but firmly. "The details can wait until you've had proper rest and nourishment." He extended his arm toward her, his eyes conveying a message that his words could not. "Trust me." With no other options before her, and night rapidly approaching, Sarah placed her gloved hand tentatively on the captain's offered arm. Whatever game this scarred military man was playing, it offered at least temporary sanctuary from the bitter cold and her increasingly desperate circumstances. "This is absurd," Miller sputtered, his face reddening further. "You can't possibly mean to welcome my intended bride?" "That's precisely what I mean to do," Blackwood replied, his voice dropping to a register that carried both authority and warning. "Unless you wish to dispute the matter further." Something in the captain's steady gaze made Miller step back, muttering under his breath about military overreach and damaged goods. The gathering crowd began to disperse, some nodding approvingly at Blackwood's intervention, while others whispered behind gloved hands about the scandal sure to follow. Captain Blackwood guided Sarah toward a waiting carriage, his movements precise and considerate without being overly familiar. Only when they were seated inside with the driver instructed to proceed did Sarah find her voice again. "Why did you do that, Captain? You don't know me. You certainly didn't send for me." Blackwood's expression remained unreadable, the scars on the left side of his face pulling his features into a permanent half-grimace that made his emotions difficult to discern. No decent man leaves a woman with child to freeze in a Montana winter, Miss Winters. Especially not when I have a perfectly good house sitting empty save for myself and occasional staff. "But you claimed me as your bride," Sarah pressed, still uncertain whether she had escaped one dangerous situation only to find herself in another. "That was a lie." "A temporary fiction," he corrected, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. "Passing by the carriage window. One that gives you shelter while you consider your options. Nothing more is expected or assumed." For the first time since stepping down from the stagecoach, Sarah felt something other than dread unfurling within her chest. Not hope exactly, she had learned the hard way that hope was a luxury she could ill afford, but perhaps a momentary reprieve from desperation. "I don't understand why you would involve yourself in my difficulties, Captain." The carriage hit a rut in the road, jostling them both. Blackwood steadied himself with practiced ease before responding. 3 years ago, I lay dying on a battlefield with half my face torn away. A Crow woman found me, took me to her village, and nursed me back to health when she could have easily left me to die. I never learned why she chose to show such mercy. To a stranger and enemy. His gloved hand unconsciously touched the scarred side of his face. But I promised myself that if given the opportunity, I would repay that debt of kindness to someone else in need. The carriage turned onto a snow-covered lane leading away from the main settlement of Fort Haven. Ahead, a substantial two-story house emerged from the gathering twilight, its windows glowing with warm lamplight against the deepening blue of evening. Hammond House, Blackwood explained. Built by a cattle baron who decided Montana winters weren't to his liking after all. I purchased it last autumn when I received my permanent posting to Fort Haven. It's larger than I need, but the price was fair. The men will want to celebrate, Captain. They've started a pool on when you'd finally find yourself a wife. I trust you won't indulge their speculation too freely. Lieutenant, James replied, though his tone carried no real reproof. Of course. Not, sir, though I admit I won't mind collecting my winnings. I had my money on before spring thaw. The young officer's easy humor broke some of the tension, drawing a small smile even from the typically reserved captain. The return to Hammond House, now officially Sarah's home, as well, brought unexpected surprises. Word of the marriage had somehow reached Fort Haven despite their attempts at privacy, and a small gathering of well-wishers waited on the front porch. Most were soldiers from James's company, along with a few of the more open-minded townspeople. News travels faster than winter lightning around here, James murmured apologetically as he helped Sarah from the carriage. To Sarah's astonishment, the reception she received was genuinely warm. The soldiers treated her with a respect bordering on reverence, clearly transferring their loyalty to their captain onto his new bride. Several of their wives had brought food and small gifts, welcoming Sarah into their circle without the judgment she had feared. "Don't you worry about those whispers from the Miller crowd," Mrs. Fletcher, the blacksmith's wife, assured her while pressing a hand-knitted baby blanket into her hands. "Half the town's been waiting for someone to put that puffed-up shopkeeper in his place, taking up with the captain instead. That's the best revenge anyone could ask for." Sarah accepted the gift with genuine gratitude, though the characterization of her marriage as revenge made her uncomfortable. "It's not quite like that, Mrs. Fletcher." The older woman patted her hand knowingly. "Of course not, dear. Love makes its own path, doesn't it? The captain's a good man underneath those scars. Half the unmarried women in town would have taken him, marks and all, if he'd shown the slightest interest." The impromptu celebration continued into early evening, with Mrs. Abernathy efficiently managing the flow of food and drinks as though she'd been preparing for this gathering all along. Sarah found herself watching James throughout the way he interacted with his men, the respect with which even the most senior officers addressed him, the occasional glances he cast her way as if checking that she wasn't overwhelmed by the unexpected. Socializing. When the last guests finally departed, Sarah felt an unfamiliar mix of emotions: exhaustion from the day's events, but also a surprising contentment. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she had been treated not as a fallen woman, but as someone worthy of celebration and inclusion. "I apologize for the invasion," James said as they settled in the study, a fire crackling in the hearth against the deepening cold outside. "I had hoped to give you more time to adjust before facing the town's curiosity." "There's no need for apologies," Sarah replied honestly. "They were kinder than I expected, though I'm not entirely comfortable with them believing this is a love match when we both know it's an arrangement of convenience." James studied the fire for a moment before responding. "People believe what brings them comfort. The idea that their battle-scarred captain found love despite his disfigurement gives them hope for their own lives." He glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. "Besides, not all aspects of our arrangement need be discussed publicly." That night brought the most awkward moment of their new relationship, the question of sleeping arrangements. James had instructed Mrs. Abernathy to move his personal effects to the bedroom adjacent to Sarah's, connected by a shared sitting room. I thought this arrangement might provide both propriety and privacy, he explained, showing her the sitting room that now separated their sleeping quarters. We can maintain appearances while ensuring your comfort. It's very considerate, Sarah acknowledged, touched by his thoughtfulness. Though people will talk if they realize we maintain separate rooms. People will talk regardless, James replied pragmatically. Better they speculate about our sleeping arrangements than you face the consequences of being an unmarried expectant mother in Fort Haven. That first night as Mrs. Blackwood, Sarah lay awake long after retiring to her room, listening to the occasional sounds of movement from the sitting room where James apparently worked late at his desk. Their arrangement was unusual by any standard. Marriage in name only between two virtual strangers, each filling a void in the other's life. Yet there was something unexpectedly comforting about knowing someone else was near, someone who had chosen to align his future with hers, despite the complications she brought with her. The following weeks brought a gradual adjustment to their new reality. James maintained his duties at the fort, often leaving before dawn and returning after Sarah had eaten dinner. Yet despite his absences, signs of his consideration appeared. Regularly books he thought she might enjoy left on the sitting room table, a writing desk installed in the morning room overlooking the snow-covered garden, additions to the nursery appearing without discussion or fanfare. Sarah, determined to contribute meaningfully to their household, began reorganizing the home's interior with Mrs. Abernathy's blessing. Years of bachelor occupancy had left Hammond House functional, but lacking the touches that transformed a building into a true home. She arranged flowers in winter-bare rooms, repositioned furniture to create more intimate conversation areas, and began meal planning that introduced variety to James's formerly Spartan diet. The captain's eating seconds at dinner now, Mrs. Abernathy noted approvingly one morning as they planned the day's meals. First time I've seen that since he purchased this place. He works long hours, Sarah replied. Proper nourishment is important. Mrs. Abernathy's knowing smile suggested she read more into Sarah's concern than mere household management, but she refrained from commenting directly. Instead, she changed the subject to practical matters. We should discuss preparations for the baby. Mrs. Blackwood, there's not much more than 3 months by my reckoning, and winters here can make travel difficult. We should ensure we have everything necessary well in advance. The use of her married name still startled Sarah occasionally, but she was gradually growing accustomed to her new identity. You're right, of course. Though I confess I know very little about what will be needed. Then it's fortunate you have me, the housekeeper replied with unexpected warmth. I've helped bring 7 nieces and nephews into this world. The tween U.S. will be well prepared when your little one decides to make an appearance. That evening, Sarah broached the subject with James as they sat in the study after dinner, one of the few times each day when they reliably found themselves in each other's company. Mrs. Abernathy suggested we begin preparations for the baby's arrival, she said, watching his reaction carefully. I wanted to consult with you before making any significant changes or purchases. James set aside the military report he'd been reviewing. This is your home now, Sarah. You needn't consult me on such matters. It's our home, she corrected gently. And while this may not be a conventional marriage, the child will be raised as yours. Your input matters. Something flickered across his scarred features, surprise, perhaps, or an emotion Sarah couldn't quite identify. I've given the nursery considerable thought, he admitted, even before your arrival. The cradle needs finishing, and I've ordered proper bedding from Helena. It should arrive within the week. You've been planning all along, Sarah realized aloud. James's gaze returned to the fire, his profile outlined against the dancing flames. Hope requires preparation, even when fulfillment seems unlikely. After a moment's hesitation, he added, My sister Emily has sent a package as well, baby clothes and such. She's quite excited about becoming an aunt, even under these unusual circumstances. You told your sister about our arrangement?" Sarah couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "Not entirely." A hint of discomfort crossed his face. "I explained that I had married suddenly and that you were expecting a child. The details of our agreement seemed unnecessary to share. So she believes the child is yours," Sarah concluded, uncertain how to feel about this partial deception. "She believes I've found happiness unexpectedly," James corrected. "The particulars of how that came to be are between us alone." The following Sunday brought Sarah's first attendance at Fort Haven's small church as Mrs. Captain Blackwood. Despite James's reassurances, she had dreaded the public scrutiny, certain that Lawrence Miller and his supporters would make their disapproval known. The reality proved surprisingly different. Reverend Gunderson welcomed them warmly, positioning them in a prominent pew near the front. Mrs. Gunderson made a point of sitting beside Sarah, effectively signaling her acceptance to the congregation. Throughout the service, Sarah was aware of curious glances, but they contained more interest than judgment. Only Lawrence Miller and his sister maintained a frigid distance, their disapproving stares burning into Sarah's back throughout the sermon. As the congregation filed out afterward, Miller deliberately stepped into their path. "Captain Blackwood," he acknowledged stiffly, pointedly ignoring Sarah. "The colonel mentioned you've been requesting additional leave in the coming months. One hopes military readiness won't be compromised by domestic considerations." The implied criticism hung in the air between them. James's posture straightened imperceptibly, his military bearing becoming more pronounced. "The fort's security remains my highest professional priority, Mr. Miller," he replied evenly, "as does my family's well-being in my personal life. Fortunately, I've never found those priorities in conflict." Miller's gaze flickered briefly to Sarah's protruding belly before returning to James. "Some would say you've taken on another man's responsibilities," he said, lowering his voice but not enough to prevent nearby parishioners from overhearing. "A burden that wasn't yours to bear." Several onlookers drew in sharp breaths at the blatant insult. Sarah felt heat rising to her cheeks, humiliation threatening to overwhelm her hard-won composure. Before she could respond, James placed a steady hand at the small of her back, the first time he had touched her so publicly since their wedding. "Mr. Miller," James said, his voice carrying clearly to those watching the exchange, "any man can father a child. It takes character to be a parent. My wife honors me with her trust in this matter, and I consider it a privilege rather than a burden to welcome her child as my own." His scarred face remained impassive, but his eyes held an intensity that made Miller step back involuntarily. "Now if you'll excuse us. My wife shouldn't be standing in this cold." The gathered onlookers parted as James guided Sarah toward their waiting carriage, murmurs of approval following in their wake. Mrs. Fletcher gave Sarah's arm a supportive squeeze as they passed, while Reverend Gunderson bestowed a benevolent smile that carried distinct satisfaction at Miller's public rebuke. Once seated in the privacy of their carriage, Sarah found herself struggling to maintain her composure. "Thank you," she managed finally, "for defending me." "For defending us." James studied her with concern. "Miller's opinions aren't worth your distress, especially in your condition." "It's not his opinion that affects me," Sarah admitted, tears threatening despite her efforts to control them. "It's knowing that others must think the same, even if they're too polite to say it aloud. That they see you as deceived or burdened by my situation." "Sarah," the gentleness in his voice drew her gaze to his. "What others think matters far less than what we know to be true. And the truth is that our arrangement, unconventional as it may be, benefits us both. You've brought life back to Hammond House in ways I hadn't realized were missing." The simple sincerity of his words touched something deep within her. This scarred, solitary man had opened his life to her without reservation, accepting not only her but the child she carried. He asked for little in return besides companionship and the opportunity to create a family he had believed forever beyond his reach. As January gave way to February, the harsh Montana winter tightened its grip on Fort Haven. Heavy snowfall isolated the community for days at a time, with only the most essential travel possible between the scattered homesteads and the fort itself. James began spending more nights at home rather than at his fort quarters, a change he attributed to the treacherous road conditions, but which Sarah secretly hoped might indicate growing comfort with their shared domestic life. Their evening routine had evolved into something Sarah found unexpectedly pleasant. After dinner, they would retire to the study where James would review military reports or correspondence while Sarah worked on preparations for the baby knitting. Small garments, organizing the layette Mrs. Abernathy had helped her assemble, or reading from the maternal advice books James's sister had thoughtfully included in her package. Often they would sit in companionable silence, but increasingly, conversation flowed between them, tentative at first, then with growing ease as they discovered shared interests in literature and history. James proved to be remarkably well-read. For a military man, his personal library containing volumes ranging from classical philosophy to contemporary poetry. "My father insisted on education before I joined the cavalry," he explained one evening when Sarah commented on his knowledge of Shakespeare. He believed a civilized mind was as important as physical courage on the frontier. "Barbarity is contagious," he used to say, "unless one inoculates oneself with culture." "He sounds like a wise man," Sarah observed, setting aside the tiny cap she'd been knitting. "You must miss him." "Every day," James acknowledged, his expression softening with memory. "He and my mother died within months of each other typhoid. I was already with the cavalry by then, stationed in Nebraska Territory. Emily had to manage everything alone until I could secure leave to return." "Your sister never married?" "She was engaged once, to a promising young attorney in Boston." A shadow crossed his face. "He broke the engagement after my injury. Claimed he couldn't subject his future children to an uncle with." He gestured vaguely to his scarred face. "Emily never forgave him. She's dedicated herself to teaching at a girls' school instead." The casual cruelty of the story struck Sarah deeply. "I'm sorry for both of you." James shrugged, affecting indifference, though Sarah could see it still pained him. It revealed his character before Emily made a grave mistake. Better to know early the mettle of those around you. The parallels to Sarah's own experience with Professor Harrington hung unspoken between them. Both had discovered the true nature of someone they trusted only when facing adversity. The difference was that James had found this revelation secondhand, through his sister's broken engagement, while Sarah had experienced betrayal directly from the man who had fathered her child. "May I ask you something personal?" James ventured, after a moment, setting aside the letter he'd been writing. "About the baby's father?" The question startled Sarah, as they had tacitly avoided this topic since her arrival. "You may ask," she replied cautiously, "though I may not wish to answer." James nodded, accepting her boundary. "Was he someone you loved, truly loved?" The directness of the question required a moment's reflection. Had she loved Professor Harrington, or merely the idea of him, the cultured, progressive academic who had seemed to value her mind as much as her companionship? "I believed I did," she answered finally. "He was a professor at the school where I taught, brilliant, charming, full of modern ideas about women's education and capabilities. He spoke of partnerships based on intellectual equality rather than traditional roles." A bitter smile touched her lips. "All those progressive notions vanished the moment I told him about the baby. He suggested, no, he insisted that I take care of the problem discreetly, then continue as though nothing had happened between us." James's expression darkened. "He wanted you to—" "Yes." Sarah cut him off, unwilling to hear the words spoken aloud. When I refused, he denied responsibility entirely, suggested I had been with others, called me manipulative and calculating. The memory still had power to wound, though less sharply than before. He arranged my dismissal from the school the following week. Moral turpitude was the official reason. And no one stood by you, family or friends? My parents were already gone, father to pneumonia 2 years prior, mother to heart failure the year after. I had an aunt in Pittsburgh who might have taken me in, but the scandal would have ruined her own precarious social standing. Sarah's hands returned to her knitting, needing occupation. So I gathered what savings I had and answered Mr. Miller's advertisement. The Montana Territory seemed far enough away to start fresh. James was silent for several moments, his scarred face unreadable in the firelight. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an emotion Sarah hadn't heard from him before, not pity, but a quiet, controlled anger on her behalf. This professor, he lives with no consequences while you bear all of them. That's often how the world works for women, Sarah replied simply. It shouldn't be. The conviction in his voice warmed something inside her. Here was a man who understood injustice when he saw it, who recognized the fundamental unfairness of her situation, not as an abstract concept, but as a personal affront to his sense of honor. As if sensing he'd ventured into territory that might distress her, James changed the subject. The baby is active tonight? He asked, nodding toward her belly where her hand rested. Sarah smiled despite herself. Very, especially after dinner. Mrs. Abernathy says it's a sign of a strong, healthy child. A look of hesitation crossed James's face. May I, he began, then stopped himself. Forgive me. That's too presumptuous. Understanding dawned on Sarah. In the weeks they'd been married, James had maintained a careful physical distance, never touching her except when absolutely necessary for propriety's sake. Now, watching her hand move in small circles over her active child, something like longing had appeared in his expression. Without overthinking the gesture, Sarah moved to the settee where he sat and gently took his hand. You don't need to ask permission, she said softly, guiding his palm to rest against the swell of her belly. This child will be yours in every way that matters. The moment James's hand made contact with Sarah's rounded belly, the baby delivered a powerful kick against his palm. His eyes widened in wonder, the scarred side of his face momentarily transformed by an expression of pure amazement that erased years of stoic restraint. That's remarkable, he whispered, his voice hushed with reverence. Sarah couldn't help smiling at his reaction. The doctor says this one has strong opinions already. A trait inherited from the mother, no doubt, James replied, a rare hint of teasing warming his voice. The intimacy of the moment hung between them, not romantic, exactly, but deeply personal in a way they hadn't yet shared. When the baby kicked again, James laughed softly, the sound so unexpected that Sarah found herself staring at him. In the months since their arrangement began, she had seen him smile occasionally, had witnessed his quiet compassion and unwavering courtesy, but never had she heard him laugh with such unguarded delight. I've felt it before, of course, Sarah said, but it's different sharing it with someone else. James reluctantly withdrew his hand, but the connection established in that moment remained, a tentative bridge forming between their separate lives. Thank you, he said simply. That night marked a subtle shift in their relationship. The careful formality that had characterized their interactions began to soften around the edges. James started returning from the fort earlier when possible, sharing more of his daily experiences over dinner. Sarah found herself watching for his arrival, taking pleasure in his company in a way that went beyond gratitude for his protection. As February gave way to March, the first hints of spring began to appear in Fort Haven, icicles dripping from eaves during daylight hours, patches of ground emerging from beneath thinning snow. Sarah's pregnancy had advanced to its final months. her body changing dramatically as the baby grew stronger. "You should consider reducing your activities," James suggested one evening, noticing her wince as she adjusted her position in the armchair. "Mrs. Abernathy tells me you were reorganizing the kitchen pantry today. Surely that could wait." Sarah shook her head, though she was secretly touched by his concern. "Keeping busy helps. Besides, there's still so much to prepare before the baby arrives. The nursery is ready," he countered. "The cradle is finished, the linens prepared, and enough tiny garments to clothe a dozen infants have been folded and arranged." "There's more to preparation than physical items," Sarah replied, setting aside her mending. "I need to feel ready in myself." Understanding dawned in James's expression. "You're worried." It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "Terrified. Actually, my mother died in childbirth with my younger brother. Neither survived." The fear she'd been suppressing for months emerged in a rush of honesty. What if something goes wrong? "What happens to the baby if I don't?" "Nothing will happen to you," James interrupted, his voice firmer than she'd ever heard it. He moved from his desk to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Dr. Maxwell is experienced, and Mrs. Abernathy has assisted at dozens of births. But even if the unthinkable occurred, you must know I would raise this child as my own, with all the love and protection I could provide." The conviction in his voice steadied her. In the short months of their marriage, James Blackwood had proven himself a man of absolute integrity. If he made a promise, he kept it, no matter the cost to himself. "I believe you," she said softly, "and that brings me more comfort than you can know." Later that week, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. She was arranging fresh pine branches in the entry hall, Mrs. Abernathy's suggestion to freshen the winter air, when a knock at the door revealed Lieutenant Davis's wife, Eleanor, standing on the porch with a covered basket. "Mrs. Blackwood," the young woman greeted her with genuine warmth. "I hope I'm not intruding. My husband mentioned you might welcome some company with the captain away at the territorial capital." James had departed 3 days earlier for Helena, summoned by the territorial governor for consultations regarding escalating tensions with several indigenous tribes. The separation, their first since their marriage, had left Sarah more unsettled than she cared to admit. "Please come in." Sarah welcomed her visitor with relief. "And it's Sarah, if you don't mind." Eleanor Davis proved to be delightful company, intelligent, plain-spoken, and refreshingly free of the judgment Sarah had feared from other military wives. Over tea in the morning room, their conversation flowed easily from household matters to Eleanor's experiences as a cavalry officer's wife. "John and I were childhood sweethearts," Eleanor explained, helping herself to another slice of Mrs. Abernathy's seed cake. "When he received his commission, I had exactly 2 weeks to prepare for marriage and life on the frontier. I cried the entire journey west." Sarah smiled at the younger woman's candor. "And now? Now I can't imagine any other life. The frontier has its hardships, certainly, but there's a freedom here that Eastern society doesn't permit. Women are valued for practical skills rather than ornamental qualities." Eleanor studied Sarah thoughtfully. "Though I must admit, your situation was unusual even by frontier standards." Heat rose to Sarah's cheeks. "I suppose the circumstances of our marriage are common knowledge. Fort Haven runs on gossip and whiskey in approximately equal measures." Eleanor confirmed with a grin. "But what fascinates everyone isn't your condition or the hasty ceremony, it's the change in the captain." "Change?" Sarah echoed, genuinely puzzled. "Sarah, the man barely spoke 10 words together before you arrived. He performed his duties impeccably, but he existed rather than lived, if that makes any sense. Now he discusses books with the officers, wives at social gatherings, has opinions on household matters, and Lieutenant Morgan swears he caught the captain whistling last week." The description startled Sarah. She had assumed James's reserved manner was simply his natural temperament, not a withdrawal from life following his injury. The idea that her presence had somehow drawn him back toward engagement with the world around him was both flattering and sobering. Their arrangement, practical as it had begun, clearly meant more to him than mere convenience. Eleanor leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially. The betting pool has shifted, you know. No longer about when the captain would marry, but about when he'll smile in public. Lieutenant Foster claims he already has, but no one believes him without witnesses. Sarah laughed despite herself. Your husbands have entirely too much time on their hands if they're wagering on my husband's facial expressions. Garrison. Life, Eleanor said with a shrug. You find entertainment where you can. After Eleanor's departure, Sarah found herself reflecting on their conversation while preparing for bed. The notion that others had observed positive changes in James was gratifying, though she wondered how much of it was simply their perception filtered through the lens of his unexpected marriage. She was just settling beneath the quilts when a sharp, twisting pain seized her lower abdomen. The sensation was different from the practice contractions she'd experienced occasionally over the past weeks, more focused, more intense. When it released, she drew a shaky breath and tried to remain calm. Dr. Maxwell had warned that false labor was common in the final months, especially for first pregnancies. When a second pain followed 15 minutes later, Sarah rang for Mrs. Abernathy. The housekeeper appeared quickly, her gray hair in a braid down her back, clearly having been preparing for bed herself. I think something might be happening, Sarah explained, trying to keep her voice steady, though it's still too early. Mrs. Abernathy's experienced eyes assessed the situation quickly. How far apart are the pains? About 15 minutes. But they're quite strong. The older woman nodded thoughtfully. Let's not alarm ourselves unnecessarily. First babies often send false signals. I'll sit with you a while, and we'll time them properly. By dawn, there could be no mistaking what was happening. The contractions had settled into a regular pattern, growing steadily stronger and closer together. Mrs. Abernathy dispatched one of the stable hands to fetch Dr. Maxwell while helping Sarah prepare for what lay ahead. The baby's coming early, Sarah said, unable to keep the fear from her voice. James isn't due back for 3 more days. Babies keep their own schedules, Mrs. Abernathy replied pragmatically, arranging clean linens. And first ones are often slow in arriving. The captain may well return before this little one makes an appearance. But as morning gave way to afternoon, it became clear the baby had its own timetable that wouldn't accommodate James's return. Dr. Maxwell arrived, his manner reassuringly calm as he examined Sarah and confirmed what Mrs. Abernathy already suspected. Sarah moved to stand beside him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder, one of the small physical connections they had begun to share more frequently. Grace doesn't see scars, James. She sees the man who holds her with such love, who speaks to her as though she understands every word. She sees her father. The word hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond its simple syllables. Father, not by blood or obligation, but by choice, a choice James had made the moment he intervened at the stagecoach station, and one he reaffirmed each day through countless small acts of devotion. As James's leave drew to a close, he approached Sarah with an unexpected proposal. I've been corresponding with Colonel Hargrove about my position, he said as they sat together in the study after Grace had been settled for the evening. There's an opportunity I'd like to discuss with you. Sarah set aside the letter she'd been writing to Eleanor Davis, who had become a regular visitor and cherished friend during the weeks following Grace's birth. What kind of opportunity? A teaching position at the Officers' Training Academy in St. Louis. James watched her reaction carefully. It would mean leaving the frontier, returning to a more established community. There would be schools for Grace when she's older, cultural opportunities, proper medical care. You'd leave the cavalry? Sarah couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. James's military identity seemed so intrinsically part of him. Not entirely. It's an instructional post-training, the next generation of officers in tactical strategy and frontier operations. My field experience makes me well suited for it, according to Colonel Hargrove. Sarah considered the possibility. St. Louis represented a middle ground between the raw frontier of Fort Haven and the rigid society of Philadelphia that had rejected her. Would you be happy there, away from active service? James's expression softened as he gazed at her. My happiness isn't tied to location or rank, Sarah. Not anymore. The simple statement carried profound meaning. This scarred, solitary man who had once defined himself primarily through military service had found something more valuable, a family that brought him genuine joy, a purpose beyond duty and obligation. You're considering this for us, aren't you? Sarah realized. For Grace and me. Fort Haven has limited opportunities for a child's education, James acknowledged. And while you've adapted admirably to frontier life, I know you miss certain aspects of Eastern society libraries, musical performances, intellectual companionship beyond the limited circle available here. The thoughtfulness behind his reasoning touched Sarah deeply. James had been observing her carefully, noting both her contentment with their home and the occasional wistfulness when she mentioned books or concerts unavailable in the territory. When would this position begin? Not until autumn. We would have several months to prepare, to decide if it's the right choice for our family. He emphasized the last word slightly, as if still marveling at its reality in his life. Our family. The phrase resonated within Sarah with unexpected power. What had begun as a desperate arrangement between strangers had evolved into something genuine and precious, a true family bound by choice rather than merely blood or obligation. I think, she said carefully, that we should consider it seriously. But not because I'm unhappy here. Hammond House has become more of a home to me than anywhere I've lived since my parents died. Relief washed over James's features. You've transformed it from a house into a home, Sarah, you and Grace both. That night, after checking that Grace was sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Sarah made a decision she had been contemplating for weeks. Instead of retiring to her separate bedroom, she crossed the shared sitting room and knocked softly on James's door. He answered quickly, already dressed for sleep in loose trousers and a simple shirt, surprise evident in his expression. Is Grace all right? She's fine, Sarah assured him. I wanted to speak with you. May I come in? James stepped back, gesturing for her to enter the room she had never before visited. Like him, it was orderly and unpretentious, a military man's quarters, made comfortable but not luxurious. A book lay open on the bedside table, and a single lamp cast warm light across the space. What is it? James asked, maintaining a respectful distance as Sarah gathered her courage. When Grace was born, she began, you spoke of wanting the chance to be a real husband to me. Not just in name or for appearance's sake. James's posture straightened slightly, his expression becoming carefully neutral. I remember. I've been thinking about that conversation ever since. Sarah moved closer, close enough to see the flicker of hope he couldn't quite suppress in his eyes. Our marriage began as an arrangement of convenience, but it has become something far more meaningful to me. You have become someone she hesitated, then continued with quiet certainty. Someone I care for deeply, James. The scarred side of his face remained impassive, but the undamaged side revealed emotions he could not conceal: hope, vulnerability, longing. Sarah, I don't want you to feel any obligation. This isn't about obligation, she interrupted gently. It's about choice. The same choice you made when you claimed me at the stagecoach station, when you offered your name to protect me, when you welcomed Grace as your own daughter. She reached up, her fingertips lightly tracing the line where scarred tissue met. Smooth skin on his cheek, the first time she had touched his face. I'm choosing you, James, as my husband in every sense, if that's still what you want. James stood completely still under Sarah's touch, hardly daring to breathe as her fingers traced the line where fire had forever marked him. In all the years since his injury, no one had willingly touched his scars, not family, not fellow soldiers, certainly not a woman whose touch he might crave. People averted their eyes, maintained careful distance, or worst of all, offered pity poorly disguised as acceptance. Yet here was Sarah beautiful, courageous Sarah, not only touching the physical manifestation of his deepest pain, but looking at him with eyes that held something he had long ago stopped hoping to see. Not pity or revulsion, but genuine affection and desire. "You don't know what you're offering," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I know exactly what I'm offering," Sarah countered, her hand still resting against his cheek. "And to whom? I've lived in your home for months, James. I've seen your character revealed in countless small moments. Your kindness to Mrs. Abernathy when her arthritis pains her. Your patience with the new recruits others dismiss as hopeless. Your tenderness. With grace that comes so naturally, you don't even recognize how special it is." Her voice softened. "The man beneath these scars is far more worthy of love than many with unmarked faces." Love. She hadn't used the word directly about her feelings, but its presence hung in the air between them, a possibility neither had dared to name aloud. "I never thought to have this," James admitted, his composure finally breaking as he covered her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his damaged skin. "After the injury, I resigned myself to a half-life duty. Honor, service, but nothing more personal. Nothing more intimate. And now?" Sarah asked, her eyes never leaving his. In answer, James slowly lowered his head, giving her every opportunity to withdraw if she wished. When she didn't move away, he closed the remaining distance between them, his lips meeting hers in a kiss of such gentle reverence that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. It was the first real kiss they had shared. Their wedding ceremony had concluded with the barest brush of lips against her cheek. This was different. This was a beginning rather than a formality, a promise rather than an obligation. When James finally drew back, the wonder in his expression made him look younger than she had ever seen him. The habitual guardedness momentarily stripped away. "Stay," he whispered, the single word holding both invitation and question. Sarah's answer was to reach up and draw his face back to hers. Later, cradled in James's arms as moonlight filtered through the curtains, Sarah felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. What had begun as a marriage of convenience, a desperate arrangement born of her need and his loneliness, had transformed into something neither could have anticipated, a genuine partnership based on mutual respect, growing affection, and now, the physical expression of those deepening feelings. "What are you thinking?" James asked softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns along her bare shoulder. "That life takes unexpected turns," she replied, nestling closer against his warmth. "6 months ago, I was alone, frightened, rejected by the man I thought loved me. Now I'm here, with a beautiful daughter and a husband who has shown me what true partnership really means." James pressed a kiss to her hair. "I'm the fortunate one. You and Grace have given me a life I had resigned myself to never experiencing." His voice grew thoughtful. "When I was injured, many people told me I was lucky just to be alive. But surviving isn't the same as living." St. Louis greeted them with a vibrancy that both exhilarated and overwhelmed after the relative quiet of Fort Haven. The city pulsed with commerce and culture, its streets busy with carriages, its waterfront crowded with steamboats and barges, carrying goods up and down the great rivers that converged there. Their new home a comfortable townhouse not far from the military academy, where James would teach, offered a stark contrast to the isolated grandeur of Hammond House. "It's smaller than I expected," Sarah admitted as they toured the property. "For the first time. But closer to everything we might need," James pointed out practically. "The academy is within walking distance. There are good schools nearby for Grace when she's older, and I'm told the public library is excellent." The mention of the library brightened Sarah's expression. Access to books had been limited in Fort Haven, with only James's personal collection and occasional shipments from his sister in Boston to sustain her love of reading. "Perhaps I could teach again someday," she mused, not having shared this thought with him before. Once Grace is in school herself. James's immediate supportive response confirmed yet again how different he was from Professor Harrington, who had viewed Sarah's teaching aspirations as a temporary occupation until marriage rather than a genuine calling. "You'd be an excellent teacher. Your patience with Grace already demonstrates that." "It would be different from what I taught in Philadelphia," Sarah acknowledged, "but perhaps more meaningful. Girls here might have different needs, different futures ahead of them than those I taught before." "Whatever you decide," James assured her, "you have my complete support." The Academy welcomed Captain Blackwood with military precision and surprising warmth. His reputation as a tactical officer had preceded him, along with commendations from Colonel Hargrove that spoke to both his battlefield courage and his leadership abilities. If his scarred appearance raised eyebrows among the more cosmopolitan officers' wives, they were quickly silenced by Sarah's evident devotion and the couple's obvious contentment. Their first autumn in St. Louis brought an unexpected visitor. James returned from the Academy one crisp October afternoon with news that both surprised and concerned Sarah. "Emily arrives tomorrow," he announced as he entered the sitting room where Sarah was reading while Grace napped. "My sister has apparently decided that letters are an insufficient means of meeting her new sister-in-law and niece." "Tomorrow?" Sarah echoed, a flutter of anxiety rising in her chest. Emily Blackwood had been a steady correspondent since their marriage, her letters warm and welcoming despite the unusual circumstances that had brought Sarah into her brother's life. But correspondence was far different from face-to-face meeting, especially with someone whose opinion clearly mattered so deeply to James. "The telegram arrived this morning," James confirmed, looking mildly apologetic. "I would have warned you sooner if I had any advance notice myself. It seems spontaneity runs in the family, though Emily typically expresses it through unexpected travel rather than impulsive marriages." The gentle teasing in his voice eased some of Sarah's tension. "Will she stay with us?" "If that's agreeable to you." "The alternative would be a hotel, which Emily can certainly afford, but which might suggest a coolness between us that doesn't exist." "Of course she must stay here," Sarah insisted, already mentally rearranging their household to accommodate a guest. "I want her to feel welcome. I just hope," she hesitated, uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Hope what?" James prompted gently. "That she approves of me." "Of us." Sarah gestured vaguely around their home. "This isn't exactly the life you might have had with someone from your own social circle." James crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair to bring his face level with hers, a gesture of intimacy he had adopted when discussing matters of importance. "Sarah, Emily's only concern has ever been my happiness. Seeing that you and Grace have brought me more joy than I believed possible will be all the approval she needs." Emily Blackwood arrived with the brisk efficiency that characterized the Blackwood siblings, stepping down from the carriage with the confidence of a woman accustomed to managing her own affairs. Tall and slender like her brother, she shared his direct gaze and decisive manner, though her face was unmarked by the scars that had altered his life's trajectory. "James," she greeted him warmly, embracing her brother with genuine affection before turning expectant eyes toward Sarah. "And you must be the woman who has accomplished what I feared impossible," giving my brother a reason to smile again. Before Sarah could respond, Emily had enfolded her in a hug that conveyed immediate acceptance. "Thank you," the older woman whispered, too softly for James to hear. "I've been worried about him for so long." Grace, not to be overlooked, made her presence known with a determined babble from Sarah's arms. Emily drew back, her face lighting with delight as she beheld her niece for the first time. "Oh, she's absolutely perfect," she declared, reaching out tentative fingers which Grace immediately grabbed with her usual curiosity. "Hello, little one. I'm your Aunt Emily, and I've brought you entirely too many presents for your mother to approve of." The visit that Sarah had approached with trepidation quickly proved to be a joy rather than an ordeal. Emily slipped into their household with remarkable ease, her affection for Grace immediate and genuine, her conversation with Sarah flowing naturally from shared interests rather than polite formality. Most revealing to Sarah was witnessing the siblings together, the easy banter, the shared references to childhood experiences, the evident bond that had sustained them through their parents' deaths, and James's devastating injury. On Emily's third evening with them, after Grace had been settled for the night, the three adults lingered over coffee in the parlor. The conversation had turned to James's students at the academy, with Emily asking insightful questions about his transition from field officer to instructor. "They respect his experience," Sarah noted with pride. "Even the cadets from privileged backgrounds, who might normally look down on someone with James's more modest origins, can't dismiss his battlefield accomplishments." Emily's expression grew thoughtful. "James has always commanded respect through competence rather than social position. It's a quality our father instilled in both of us." She turned to her brother with a more hesitant look. "Have you told Sarah about father's expectations? About the inheritance?" James shifted slightly in his chair, an uncharacteristic sign of discomfort. "It hasn't seemed relevant until now." Sarah glanced between the siblings, confused. "What inheritance?" Emily looked surprised. "You don't know?" "Our father left a considerable trust for James's children, trust that now rightfully belongs to Grace as James's legal daughter." "Emily," James cautioned, his tone suggesting this wasn't how he had planned to broach the subject. "She should." "No, James," Emily insisted. "Grace's future education, her opportunities, these are all secured by father's foresight. It was his way of ensuring his grandchildren would have advantages regardless of the military's capricious pay scales." Sarah sat very still, absorbing this unexpected revelation. "I didn't know your family had such resources," she said carefully, looking to James. "You've never mentioned it." "Because I've never considered it particularly important," he replied, meeting her gaze directly. "The money is in trust specifically for any children I might have, not for my personal use. When father established it, I was young and unmarried, with what everyone assumed would be a conventional future ahead of me. After my injury," he gestured to his scarred face, "I assumed the trust would eventually revert to Emily's children since I was unlikely to have any of my own. But now there's Grace," Emily concluded, her expression softening as she looked at Sarah. "And father would have been delighted to know his granddaughter will benefit from his planning, regardless of how she came into the family." The simple acceptance in Emily's voice, the complete lack of judgment about Grace's origins, or the unusual circumstances that had brought her into the Blackwood family moved Sarah deeply. Here was yet another confirmation that the desperate gamble she had taken in accepting James's proposal had led not just to security, but to genuine belonging within a family bound by choice rather than merely blood. "I don't want Grace to be defined by financial advantages," Sarah said after a moment's reflection. "But knowing her education is secure, that she have opportunities regardless of our circumstances, that's a profound gift." James reached across the space between them to take her hand. "One of many gifts my family has received through you, Sarah, far more valuable than any trust fund." Later that night, after Emily had retired to the guest room, Sarah found James in his study reviewing lesson plans for the following day's classes. She paused in the doorway, observing the man who had transformed from reluctant savior to beloved husband in the span of a year. "Why didn't you tell me about the trust?" she asked quietly. James set aside his papers, giving her his full attention. "I didn't want you to think I had married you for Grace, to secure an heir for a trust fund I had long since resigned myself to never using. I would never have thought that, Sarah assured him, crossing to perch on the edge of his desk. But it does make me realize how little I know about your life before Fort Haven. Before. She gestured to his scars. James was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Before the injury, my life followed a predictable course: military academy, cavalry commission, steady advancement through the ranks. I was engaged briefly to a general's daughter, but we parted ways when I received orders to the frontier. A wry smile touched his lips. She preferred the social advantages of eastern posts to the uncertainties of frontier assignments. And after? Sarah prompted gently. After everything changed. Not just my appearance or my military prospects, but how I saw myself, how others saw me. His voice remained steady, but Sarah could hear the echo of old pain beneath the words. The engagement I mentioned, it had been tentatively renewed when I returned east for medical treatment. It lasted precisely 3 days before Caroline decided she couldn't face a lifetime with. He gestured to his scarred face. This. Sarah reached out, her fingers tracing the line of damaged tissue with the gentle familiarity she had developed. Over months of marriage. Her loss, she said simply. Though I can't regret the path that eventually led you to that stagecoach station last winter. James caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm with the open affection he now displayed. Regularly in private. Nor can I, if someone had told me then that a year later I would have a wife I adore and a daughter who brings me daily joy, I would have dismissed them as cruelly optimistic. And if someone had told me that my greatest humiliation would lead to my greatest happiness, Sarah replied, I would have been equally skeptical, yet here we are. Here we are, James agreed, drawing her into his lap with practiced ease. A family built not from obligation or necessity, but from choice. Every day, a choice to love despite scars both visible and hidden. As his lips found hers with the familiar tenderness that still had power to make her heart race, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From mail-order bride to beloved wife, from desperate young woman to confident mother, she had transformed alongside James, who had made his own journey from isolated survivor to devoted husband and father. Their beginning had been unconventional, their path marked by challenges that might have defeated lesser spirits. But in choosing each other, not once in a moment of desperation, but daily in countless small acts of care and commitment, had created something remarkable, a family defined not by circumstance but by love. A home built on the foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection that had grown between them. As Grace's soft cry echoed from the nursery, they shared a smile of perfect understanding. Their daughter, for she was truly theirs in every way that mattered, was calling, and together they would answer, as they would continue to do through all the days ahead, bound by the strongest ties of all, those freely chosen, day after day, in the face of whatever life might bring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.